The primary purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. The views, information, or opinions expressed by hosts or guests are their own. Neither the show nor any of its content should be construed as investment advice or as a recommendation to buy or sell any particular security. Security-specific information shared on this podcast should not be relied upon as a basis for your own investment decisions. Be sure to do your own research. The podcast hosts and participants may have a position in the securities mentioned personally through sub-accounts and/or through separate funds and may change their holdings at any time.
Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of This Week in Intelligent Investing. Great to have my co-host, Elliot Turner, with me, and super excited to welcome special guest Tom Morgan to the podcast. Tom is founder of The Leading Edge, a network for personal evolution. He also authors a Substack named The Leading Edge as well, which I would highly recommend. And the way I became aware of Tom first was his talk at the Zone conference last year, where he basically had to distill 10 years of research on curiosity into about 5 minutes, Tom. I don't know how you did it, but you did do that. It was terrific. And more recently, our mutual friend, Eric Markowitz, connected us. So, Tom, great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
So I'd love to start just a little bit with your path and background and how you came to be interested in these topics that I would say we don't normally talk about enough in the investment community.
Yeah, I think I have a deep expertise in mistakes, having made all of them in the course of the last 10 years of my life. I started in the city of London with Merrill Lynch, 20 years ago this year. And I really enjoyed, I would say, the first 11 years on the sell side. I was in equity sales. I was being paid to learn. I was being flown all over the world, first class for no reason. It was really spectacular. And I think I made the mistake of staying on a little too long. That the last 2 years that I spent on the street in sort of 2015 to 2017, I'd really kind of lost interest in the markets in any meaningful way. And I was in a place where I felt like I didn't have enough product to sell. And I'd really lost a lot of the enthusiasm. And I was surrounded by people who I felt were silently feeling the same way. My body and my brain started to break down. I think because I was being well paid and I had a nice managing director title and had everything ostensibly that I should have, I was very reluctant to complain. And I had what I can only describe as a spontaneous unity experience stroke psychotic break on a trading floor in 2017 that kind of shattered my understanding of what reality was and my place in it. I then became absolutely insufferably spiritual for about 2 months and made all the classic spiritual ego inflation mistakes then. And then for about 2 years, I had a really, really pretty hellish dark night of the soul in Manhattan, where my overriding preoccupation was, how do we move towards something more meaningful in midlife when perhaps we're feeling less alive in the career path that we've chosen? And once again, you'll witness a theme of me making every single possible mistake. I decided that finance was useless and meaningless, and therefore all the skills that I'd acquired in finance had to go out of the window. And instead, I tried to be a hospice worker and spent 4 months watching people die. And then I tried to be a recruiter to help people find their own path in life and hated that. I went back and sold credit card data to hedge funds for a year, and that was certainly the worst year of my life. I then went to Fordham to study social work, and everything I did was a catastrophe, and I wasn't good at it. And I really felt like I was failing ever downwards. Eventually, I got bailed out of what was a kind of an increasingly non-functional state about 3 weeks before lockdown with the help of ketamine infusions on 50th Street, Columbia. And then I slowly rebuilt my psyche over the course of 11 months, kind of learned how to speak again, as I'd really lost the ability to speak coherently, and became increasingly interested in a series of ideas and thinkers that helped contextualize my experience in something that was quite rationalist friendly. It wasn't woo-woo spirituality and it wasn't cold psychiatry. And I started writing about these things. And my work was spotted by a former internal client at my firm who ran a very large wealth manager. He hired me really out of nowhere to write about these topics for them, which they unbelievably generously did for about 3 years. And then around about the Sohn conference last year, I realized there was a wider audience for this. And really, when I came and told my story in our industry, I think because I don't have an identity to protect and I don't have to pretend I'm an expert in anything, a lot of people come to me afterwards and they say I'm in the same position, but they feel very ashamed, they feel very secretive, and there isn't really a space for them to explore issues beyond their industry, whether it's consciousness, Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, different career paths, different identities, whatever it is they're interested in. They don't really necessarily have a community in the burbs in America, or they're afraid that it shows that they've lost their edge. For whatever reason, it's hard for them to explore it. And that's what I created with the Leading Edge. And that's what I've built now. And I guess all I'll say to end up is that there has been conclusive proof that there is enormous demand for this.
And so when you first went down that rabbit hole, how did you get started on that journey? And then what are kind of the breadth of the areas you explored that got you finally to the topic of curiosity?
Yeah, my gateway drug was Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist. I think he's not a very good writer, to be honest, but I would recommend The Power of Myth to anyone. It's a dialogue from a TV show on PBS that, because it's a dialogue and because it was towards the end of his life, it's a distillation of a lifetime spent on mythology. And what I realized after many, many years was that mythology basically sometimes describes hidden patterns. And the hero's journey in particular, which is the most famous and is 11 of the top 15 highest grossing movies ever, actually literally is an operating manual for the transition in consciousness. From sort of ego-led to being led by your environment or being led by your curiosity, which is why we keep telling the story over and over again, because it's a description of a force that may not be visible to us, but if we ignore it, can kind of destroy our lives. And I didn't know at the time that was why I was getting interested in Joseph Campbell, which sort of speaks to my point that I was being guided by a force within his work that I didn't understand at the time. And as I got more and more interested in things, it felt like the information was kind of accelerating towards me. Later and after I went through, on the other side of my crisis, I discovered the work of this neurologist called Dr. Ian McGilchrist that formed the basis of my Sohn talk, but really all of my work for sort of the last 5 years, I would say. And he has this absolutely revolutionary theory about the brain hemispheres, which, if it's a metaphor for the way reality works, it's perfectly effective. If it's true, which I suspect it is, it's one of the most meaningful hypotheses really of the last few centuries, and I think is a very helpful gateway drug for people into sort of the topics of consciousness and mystery.
So how do we know if it's true? What's the controversy, I guess, that exists out there?
Yeah, so I think when we were all growing up, we were told that one side of our brain is mathematical and one side of our brain is artistic or something. And it's just not true. That's been debunked. But then that means that whenever the topic of hemispheres come up, people are like, oh, that was all debunked by science. And it hasn't actually. McGilchrist uses the example of a bird. So both sides of our brain can do the same thing, which is why you can lose access to one hemisphere and actually still remain a pretty functional human being. But the way that each side of the brain does something is very different. So his favorite example is a bird. Both sides of the brain pay attention, but the left hemisphere is very narrowly focused and relational in terms of the way it interacts with the world, that it's trying to find things to manipulate and eat, lock onto things like a predator would. So it's narrowly focused, linear, and logical. And then the right side of the brain is very holistic and has a wide arc of attention. So if you imagine a bird, the left hemisphere is pecking at the ground and trying to work out whether something is a grain of sand or a piece of grain. And then you have the right hemisphere that's looking out for cats. So both sides of the brain are paying attention. They're just paying attention in radically different ways. And when you apply it to human beings, the left hemisphere, as I said, is very narrowly focused, linear, logical, hyperverbal, loves abstractions. But it's ultimately very disconnected from the world. It manipulates things and it makes single point interventions in ways that can actually be quite catastrophic, which is something we see over and over again in finance and more broadly. And then the right hemisphere of the brain is emotional, somatic, energetic, and largely nonverbal, all of which are modes of interacting with the world that are very fuzzy, very woo-woo, very denigrated. They're often non-logical. They're not illogical, they're non-logical. And they require a certain degree of faith in giving them, in being able to trust them, which means that for the industries that we're all familiar with, that's all a terrible setup. I'm getting the sense that we should probably do X. And then someone says, why? And you say, well, because I have a feeling. Good luck with that. Good luck not being able to put that in the spreadsheet. And when people get stuck in life because the niche that they're in no longer has any energy in it, they have to move to a completely different method of cognition. They have to move from this left hemispheric agency, which typically has made them incredibly successful and relentless. And they have to move to this right hemispheric power that they've never used. And that can be very, very scary and very, very difficult, which I think is why it remains so controversial.
I'm curious. I didn't realize that they debunked this kind of rift between the hemispheres. Is there a tie to handedness? Or has that been debunked as well?
I think that people who are left-handed are more likely to have their hemispheres flipped, but I don't know that with a lot of detail.
And it seems kind of interesting that lefties do have, I don't know, this reputation for being a little more artistic, a little more creative. And something in evolution seems striking that those people who by definition have these traits are, I think it's something like 12% of the population at large, that for whatever reason, they are just underrepresented. I'm curious, like, do you think there's some cause and effect there?
I often think of the concept of shamanism, which just because we stop talking about things doesn't mean they stop existing. And you used to have a tribe where there would be a shaman, and the shaman would routinely have gone completely bonkers, gone into the woods for a couple of years, and then come back with a different mode of perception. And there's a great wisdom expert called John Vervaeke that talks about the ability of the shaman, literally or figuratively, to go into sort of astral flight. And then they would get an overview of the situation. That's literally where the word overview comes from. So what they would do is they would break the stuck perspective of the rest of the crowd. And they would be able to go above the situation and be like, Elliot, there's some water over there. Guys, you're missing the whole picture. They would break the frames for everyone else. But if everyone was the shaman, it would be complete chaos and pandemonium the entire time. So I often think of like these neurodiverse features or people that can break frames as kind of these necessary correctives that guys like, we've really gone off track here and we're hurtling off track very quickly. And I can get us back to that archetypal pattern. I can get us back to this archetypal force. And this is actually what a prophet does. A prophet doesn't say, here is the future. A prophet can see the whole pattern and can basically say, guys, this is where we've gone wrong. And actually, I think that kind of applies back to what Vervaeke's saying, which is that we used to be led by the right hemisphere, and that the left hemisphere was the tool that we would use to analyze the places that the right hemisphere was leading us. So like, he's literally able to see this entire picture and be able to say, guys, this is where we've gone wrong and this is where we should get back to. So that, I think, is actually the purpose of neurodivergence within this context.
So just to maybe get to the conclusion here, and then we'll kind of backtrack. How do we apply this knowledge? What can we actually do to make our lives better, our decisions better?
I'm glad you asked that question, because that's what my wife asks me every time. She's like, yeah, very interesting rabbit hole, Tom. Is it making you a better dad? Is it making you a better husband? Like I gave this talk at Sohn where I was like, I think we're dangerously left brain locked. And if you manage to reorient towards your right, everything in your life just goes better. And the fact is that AI is coming for your left brain anyway. So you better be doing this whether or not you want to. It just so happens that it will make your life better. So I basically spent all of last year writing a series that's available for free. It's on my Substack. It's on my website. That's essentially, all right, what do you do about it? How do you turn this into daily practice? And I came away with 11 different practices that are increasingly deviate from the consensus. Because, to my point, the moment you start talking about a lot of these things, they're not typically mainstream practices, although they are going more mainstream, and I can certainly prove that anecdotally within my community. So let's be specific. There's a spectacular neuroscientist called Dr. Anla Lecomte. Her focus is curiosity. And both her and my favorite career coach I know, a guy called Devin Martin, both recommend the same thing, which is to keep an energy diary, which is for, say, 2 weeks. What you do is you meticulously document how everything in your life is making you feel energetically. Every interaction you have with people. Did I leave this meeting with Elliot feeling more energetic than I went in, or less energetic than went in? When I do this particular exercise at work, how do I feel? When I do this thing for pleasure, how do I feel? That basically starts to attune you to energetic sensitivity, which is fundamentally right hemispheric. And I can already feel some people being like, ugh, this all sounds very, very loosey-goosey, very woo-woo. But it's like, no, that's actually how the right hemisphere like interacts with the world. And the right hemisphere has access to literally millions of times more information than the left hemisphere does. So it becomes an increasingly sophisticated way of navigating the world. Another one is emotional granularity. We talk about everyone in finance knows the story of George Soros's back pain, that basically, his son gave an interview, I think, to the Irish Times saying that, George always gives these very clever sounding reasons for why he shifted his portfolio, but actually it's because his back spasms whenever his portfolio is positioned wrongly. And everyone always giggles at that, and it's like, what a fun anecdote. And then you have to realize that Soros understood what it meant when his back hurt. That for you and I, we might be like, oh, my back's spasming. Maybe I did too many deadlifts. Maybe I drank too many martinis, whatever it is. He was like, no, when my back spasms, I know it's about my portfolio. He was able to interpret an unconscious signal. Our right hemisphere signals to us non-verbally, emotionally, and somatically in our body. So the point is, emotional granularity is how many words you have for your emotions. And that actually corresponds with your physical and mental health and how little time you spend in hospital, how long you're going to spend in therapy, because what it is how accurately you can interpret your inner state. If you imagine your unconscious is constantly signaling to you all the time, but you are mostly ignoring it, it has to get louder until eventually it blows up your life, which is what it did with me, which is I ignored it for a long time in an office. And as a result, it had to literally blow up my brain using like a Unity experience to get me to quit my job. So if you don't do that, if you learn to get a lot of different words for your emotions, you can learn to close the feedback loops for what your unconscious is trying to signal to you really, really quickly. And that gives you a much finer appreciation for how to navigate the world.
Can you maybe elaborate a little on how you do that within what may be artificial confines that kind of restrict your degrees of freedom to act? Like, you can't just follow your energy.
No. Okay. So what you can do, and this is actually Anne Law's recommendation, and the one thing that's had dramatically higher success rates for the people that I've worked with is what she calls tiny experiments, which is like, say you're either stuck or you're thinking about something else there, and you want to take a step towards something you prefer doing, but essentially you don't want to blow up your life because you have kids and commitments and little time. So what you do is you think about a point of differentiation. Is there something I can do, ideally quite uniquely, that I could just do forever, right? That feels like a grind to everyone else and feels like total play to me. Rather generically for me, it's writing about a certain number of things, right? But I always felt that I was never going to get paid for it. And I actually rejected that ability to synthesize and write indefinitely until eventually I ran out of options and started doing it. And then the universe was immediately like, oh, good, have your dream job, right? Because what you need to do is you need to find a way of doing that thing you can't not do and then offering it to the world in an experiment. Say you're stuck in finance, but you really want to write about Carl Jung. Great, create an anonymous handle and start writing the Substack. Start writing a newsletter and sending it out. Or like maybe it's cooking. Maybe actually like you just have to admit to yourself that you really like organizing dinner parties and cooking. And that feels like a really low powered, low rent way of going about things. But that's also an easy experiment. Organize an event for 15 of your friends at an event and cook for them. See how it feels. Do you get environmental feedback? Either your friends thinking it's really good, or do you get a synchronicity, which is also a woo-woo, in my opinion, completely real concept, which is when you find the right experiment and implement it, you get a signal from your environment that you've gone in the right direction. That's a way of you experimenting with different directions and identities without blowing up your life. The problem is that your experiment is probably very different from mine because you're a completely different individual to me. And so the experimentation around what you want to implement and what you want to test is a kind of an annoying, slow, and iterative process.
And do you feel that in the people you've met and spoken to, that like everyone inevitably has a North Star they can become immersed in as an interest, or are there certain types who are kind of the perpetual wanderers, perpetual creatives who just want to find and explore, and the exploration is the goal itself?
I think we had to back up and work out what optimal cognition would look like. Like there's a lot of like pathologizing of attentional styles, and you're like, all right, wait. Everyone stop. What would optimal cognition look like? And I'm not a neuroscientist or a psychologist, but let's just be basic here. So I'm kind of obsessed with the concept of wisdom. Wisdom is the number one correlate of life satisfaction in later life, beating everything from financial to material to social. What wisdom is knowing what to pay attention to and when, and what to do and when. The opposite of wisdom is anxiety, which means you burn a whole bunch of energy on things that are ultimately pointless. You spend your life like worrying about things that aren't ever going to matter, right? Which is why wisdom correlates with life satisfaction. What is wisdom? For me, wisdom is having very, very, very broad attention, being very distractible until something grabs your attention, at which point you lock onto it like an apex predator and you murder the crap out of it. You go down that rabbit hole for as long as it has energy for you, and then whoomp, you widen out again. You do the wide sweep, explore, exploit, constant trade-off. Now, unfortunately, our culture and our society doesn't often give people, or at least it doesn't feel like you have the freedom to keep doing that attentional switching, but that's what it should look like. I think that to address the implicit question you're asking, I think when people are very left brain locked, which is a lot of people in investing because they tend to be the people that are good at investing, it can be very, very, very difficult for them to be able to find the new North Star or even a North Star because they're not energetically connected to the world. And I think the people at the other end of the spectrum who are hyper energetically connected to the world have no agency a lot of the time, because even when they see something interesting, they can't like latch onto it with sufficient effectiveness. So you don't want to be at either end of the spectrum, but the idea would be right in the middle.
So are there some investor types that you would say kind of fit this well, or in terms of acquiring wisdom over time and ending up in that place that we all want to get to, or investment approaches, investment styles, anything there that you feel has some predictable value?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when people ask me this question, I always think of Druckenmiller. Not that I'm like a big student of Druckenmiller or even know that much about this, but like the idea that you have really powerful conviction and can put on these huge trades until you don't, at which point you pivot on a dime. That kind of cognitive flexibility, that kind of baseline assumption that the market is smarter than you. But when you see an opportunity, you can get very, very big in it. That strikes me as kind of this manifestation of wisdom. There's this sort of cadence where the good investors start off as intuitive, but their intuitions are crap because they have no experience. And then they build the mechanical, analytical skills at the middle of their career But ultimately, I think that's not sustainable except for a very, very, very small number of people, because basically that's been automated. And then once people have transcended that, they have real expert intuition that they can deploy towards their portfolio, even just knowing what companies they should be looking at. Like, a lot of people can't explain why they're starting to diligence a certain company, and they certainly always can't explain why they've sold it or bought it. They can explain it when a consultant asks, because that's their job. But when you become really good friends with the people that have been doing this for 40, 50 years, they'll tell you they have no idea. They'll be able to go in and check it out analytically afterwards, but they have no idea where the initial impulse comes from, because it comes from the right hemisphere. Doesn't mean it's dumb, and it usually has to, there has to be an enormous amount of expert intuition behind that decision, but it isn't often. Let me make this tangible for you. There was a horse trainer called Frank Morier that McGilchrist talks about, that spent decades as a horse trainer, and then he retired and started to help the bookies with odds. And what he would do is he would watch the horses warm up for a couple of minutes, and then would just give better odds to the bookies than they currently had. And the bookies were like, well, fantastic. Can you systematize this for us so we can leverage it? And not only could he not systematize it, his attempts to systematize it made his performance worse, because he was overlaying analysis over a stronger intuitive force. He was brute forcing the right hemisphere out using the left hemisphere, and that is a weaker servant. And so that, I think, is sort of how good investors are, which is that they are led predominantly by the right hemisphere. And there's a lot of them, but they don't tend to be very famous.
Are there some hobbies or other pursuits that an investor could take up to sort of train that right hemisphere and get better at it?
Yes. That's really the purpose of my community, to be honest, which is that everyone's different and everything should be done in community, and everything, like, everyone's enthusiasms are different. And I think, when you get to your mid-40s, it can be very easy to be a professional dilettante at all these different practices. You become a meditation guy for a month, whatever it is, right? Like, I think that you do need to experiment with a lot of different things. Again, the explore thing, and then you need to exploit when you find something you really care about. One of the ways that I've heard this framed that I think is very useful in terms of practice is John Vervaeke, again, a great wisdom expert, and he talks about having an ecology of practices that are mutually self-supporting, so that if one of them kind of falls down, you've got the others to rely on. And he says meditative, so for him it's vipassana; contemplative, which for him is metta meditation, loving kindness, which kind of connects you to the world in a relational way. It connects that right hemisphere to the world. And then you have embodied, which for him is tai chi. So for me, I'm obsessed with Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I've just come from there now. I've been doing it for 4 years. It's hyper embodied. It's very complex. It's a kind of a pursuit of mastery, and it completely resets me cognitively for the day. But for some of the investors I speak to, it's tennis. A lot of people, it's meditation. I think one thing that's really worked within my community is actually somatic meditation, which is that for some people, meditation is too heady. What am I thinking? Am I stopping my thoughts? Am I looping my thoughts? It's all thought. And one of the things that's really resonated over the last year of us testing out these practices is somatic meditation, which is, really dropping into the body. And there's lots of different ways to talk about that, none of which I'm an expert in. But the idea being that often we feel these quote unquote right hemispheric impulses through our body first. We feel our intuition through our body first, and our body tends to get very denigrated in a head-centric society. Capitalism literally means headism, right? So you tend to ignore those impulses coming from the body. George Soros's back pain. But if you start to cultivate somatic meditation, you'll notice that there is an intrinsic intelligence coming from there that will really improve your life.
That's really interesting. And meditation's not exactly this, but the first two that you'd mentioned were physical endeavors. And I think of myself, what I've really picked up is swimming. And there are a few things I find nice about it. You can't have your phone no matter what, so it's forced disengagement. And it's incredibly rhythmic, right? You count your breaths, you count your strokes, and generally do it in a pool. Kind of confined by weather and conditions here, and it's very back and forth, but you kind of tap it. Your mind gets to wander, but without getting too lost in some ways. find it to be interesting. Do you like any? I'm curious what other physical endeavors, or like what you how do you then take what you've done in that experiment, that physical endeavor, and like bring it back to what you're doing in investing? Because it really is very distant. It's like very different.
I think you have to not do that. I think that part of the danger with all of this is it all becomes a means to an end, right? And I appreciate I'm kind of contradicting what I just said in terms of having all these different means to all these different ends. But for me, I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because I love it, right? I DJ because I love it, right? Like I go and get a massage once a week because I love it. All of my best thinking is done in those circumstances, but I would do them anyway now. I've found a way to love them intrinsically. So I think the problem is that once something becomes instrumental, it starts to lose a lot of its power. The thing I will say in terms of physicality is that I would just like flounce around the gym, listening to podcasts and checking my phone and like half working up a sweat. I'm not one of those psychopaths that can go into the gym and just work themselves to the bone. And I do think that in today's world, you need a more extreme intervention against the more extreme warfare being deployed at your attention from all these different sources. So for me, it's like you cannot think about anything else while a black belt is trying to choke you unconscious as they were an hour ago. Right? You just cannot do that. And so I think if you're a person that's prone to distraction, choosing something of appropriately intense physicality is very, very helpful. But if you are the kind of person that can go on a run, even a light one, and get completely out of their heads, fine, that's you. You know, like I did swim for a bit, but I didn't intrinsically love swimming. So I would say aim for something you intrinsically love in terms of what your choice of physicality.
Do you feel like the world we live in is increasingly less welcoming to kind of right-brained people? Because we're kind of in an algorithmic world, and as you said, with AI, it's very much a kind of a obsolescence of the left side of the brain, but also then navigating this world for a right-brained person might be a challenge, but maybe it's also the source of the unique, differentiation and advantage. How do you kind of look at that, if I made myself clear in any way?
I think my answer is yes. Right? Like you said, both things, and both things are true, which is a difficult tension to hold, which is if you look at the market, if you could have $1 trillion wiped off the market in one day because of the potential for DeepSeek to be better than ChatGPT, like not even the guarantee, for the potential for there to be a lower compute, higher ability platform, you have a remarkably fragile ecosystem, right? We're now not just reliant on one industry, one company, we're reliant on a single technology for the health of basically the entire stock market. And that technology is the instantiation of the left hemisphere, right? So, Sauron, Ahriman, whatever you want to call it, he is the king of our industries now. The left hemisphere is the king of our industries if you look at just distribution of market cap, and everything else has been left by the wayside. So if you're telling me, like, if you would like power, then yes, be more left hemispheric. Look at who is at the top of every industry, pretty much. They are powerful left hemispheric people, but there are fewer and fewer of them because this is a fundamentally unstable ecosystem. So if you want to maintain your fundamental human advantage in that system, you can either try and outrun AI, good luck, or you can lean into the right hemisphere and your intrinsic human advantages with the faith and assumption that it will at least be able to take you into a more pleasurable niche. That the people that I know that have found the niche that they prefer don't really care about playing the power games anymore. Like, I earn a quarter of what I earned at 28, never been happier in my entire life by an order of magnitude, and I don't actually compare myself to anyone else anymore. And I think there's something much stranger happening, which is that, again, I can only speak anecdotally, but I have a lot of anecdata, which is that there is a huge common knowledge game unfolding now within finance about consciousness topics. When I came off stage at Sohn, there were a bunch of people with tens, maybe hundreds of billions of market cap that came up to me and were like whispering to me that they were really interested in these topics around consciousness. And I was like, why the hell are you guys whispering? And there's still this idea that by showing an interest in a topic that I think transcends markets, which is all things consciousness, you're going to lose your edge. You're going to get soft. You're going to lose that left hemispheric edge, and you're going to become more spiritual and wafty and less efficient and less effective. And that persists. But trust me when I say that very, very, very senior people, often the people at the very top of their game, are incredibly interested in these topics. They just won't necessarily be talking about them outside of communities like mine.
Is there a way, how do we know whether our intuition is right or not, other than just going with it and seeing what happens? Are there ways to, try to develop a feel for when, that gut feel should be trusted and when it shouldn't?
Feel, as you just said, the intensity of the energetic pull. I think reps, one of the first episodes I did in my series was a guy called Cedric Chin. And he talks about intuition in bounded and unbounded domains, which is that essentially you need to get as many reps as you can where you get clear feedback as to the reasons why you failed, which then builds an increasing somatic sense and confidence that actually your intuition is right. But also you get to get it wrong a lot of the time. And actually the problem is that most of the industries that we're all set up in don't allow for repeated failure. One of the members of my community, he was given an emerging markets book way, way, way too young, and then proceeded to blow up for 10 years because that's what emerging markets do. And now he trades technicals incredibly well. Like, his numbers are incredible. And he trades purely gut feel. But because he was allowed to blow up for 10 years, and our industry is now so competitive that you just don't get to do that. And actually, most industries are so competitive that you don't get to do that. And so I would say to people, if you're worried about how good your gut is, one, you need to be doing all the practices that we're talking about in terms of you getting a connection to that gut, to that somatic sense. But actually, you need to be finding ways to consistently fail. And often very left hemispheric and very high achieving people have not failed and are not comfortable with failure. I am one of those people. But one of the other members of my community who runs another very successful hedge fund is like, the reason why I succeed is because I compete against 30-year-old Ivy League guys who've never failed before in their life. And once they start failing in their mid-30s, they don't have the cognitive tools to withstand it, and they make dumb decisions. There's something to that.
And I think George Soros actually talked about always running little experiments in the markets, and it's seeing, is his thesis correct? Is his hypothesis right or not? That sounds like a way to train your intuition. So is that so? And if that's the case, how would you go about training one's intuition as an investor? Does journaling help with that, or other practices?
Mobison says keep a decision diary. So like, work out what your percentage certainty is on certain outcomes before you make a decision, and then look at it after the decision has been made and after the outcome has come through, to work out how strong your intuition was. The problem with the markets is that you often don't know why you are unsuccessful, right? Like, if a price moves 10% against you, but you didn't actually have thesis confirmation one way or another, and you had to follow your stop loss, like, were you right for the right or the wrong reasons? And if it goes with you, same. I think markets are just intrinsically very, very difficult in terms of finding out whether you've got feedback. There are other areas, if you're playing chess, like a fundamentally bounded domain, you know why you lost, right? Like, someone could be like, move 37. That's when you lost, dude. And so I think that investing, you basically either need to understand what your confidence interval was before you made a decision, and then sense check it afterwards, so you don't rewrite the narrative in your own head. but it can unfortunately just be really difficult to know why you failed.
One of the things I've been thinking about as you've talked through, like as we've pivoted to investing a bit, is like left brain versus right brain in investing could also be viewed a little bit along the value versus growth spectrum, where value is very formulaic, very algorithmic, and it's got more boundaries to it. And right brain is a little more like creative and visualizing, like, this thing's growing. What can it be in the future, and what does it look like? But when I think about that, and try to ground it, there's also in the right side of the spectrum, the right brain side, the range of possible outcomes is just so much greater. So the risks are much greater, as are the rewards. And the time between feedback from when you make a decision to when you know if you're right and wrong is even farther disconnected. So, like, how can you, or is there a right way to approach embracing your right brain in investing while not overstepping your boundaries of risk? And I know a lot of the answer will have to be personal, but I'm curious if you've thought about how to apply it, or if this sounds like absolutely a little too far out there.
No, it's not. I think it only works-ish because there's a lot of incredibly left brain growthy companies. In fact, they're sort of the apex predators, right? Like, yes, you have to have the vision to see where they can go. I think there's a nuance that I really like. There's a guy called Chris Begg, who's done two of my favorite investing interviews ever, one with William Green of Richer, Wiser, Happier, and one with my friend Bogomil Baranovsky. But he talks about something called dynamic quality. And dynamic quality is kind of a tough philosophical idea, but it's essentially the Tao. It's a company that's oriented towards beauty and goodness and a product that consumers love. Maybe like the original iPhone. I remember holding an iPod Touch for the first time and being like, oh my God, this thing's going to take over the world. But one of my favorite examples ever is with an interview from 2015 with Brunello Cucinelli. And he talks about how you're not allowed to send an email to more than 2 people at a time in the company. He pays people 20% above market. Everyone works 9 to 5:30, no exceptions. And the aim of the company is to produce beauty. And it's a 7x since IPO, right? Like, and a lot of people would be like, you can't do that in today's world. You'll get out competed by Shine or something. It's like, no, it depends what you're doing. But like, you can produce quality. And I think that a truly balanced hemispheric perspective helps you turn up those companies. Now, the awkward fact is that there are fewer and fewer of those companies in public markets because public markets favor left hemispheric style businesses, which is just the nature of late stage capitalism. But I think when investors that can get an intangible sense for that kind of dynamic quality, I hope that's what investing is going to look like over the next 20 years.
It's interesting. Dynamic quality. I was first introduced to that concept in Robert Pirsig's book, Lila.
Yeah.
And I thought it was fascinating to me. Like, I've so strongly associated the word quality with good, that quality is inherently good. But in Lila, that almost, it doesn't flip quality on its head from what I'd understood it to be, but quality is literally dynamic. It's volatile. It's hard to explain, and it's a lot messier than good itself would imply.
Well, you're having to outcompete, right? It's that, our friend Eric Markowitz wrote a piece about a hot spring in Japan that's been around for 1,300 years, and the operating principle is be like water, which very very Bruce Lee sounding stuff. But I read the case study that Eric linked to, and it was essentially a big part of that is knowing the opportune moment to act, which is that having enough flexibility in your business model that if you suddenly need to pivot in a non-rational direction, not irrational, a non-rational direction, you have the freedom to do that, because things are changing so fast right now that if you don't have that freedom built into your business model, you're not going to make it. And I would really point people towards Rory Sutherland, the vice chairman of Ogilvy UK, to look at the way that he looks at non-rational business structures that create room outside of the spreadsheet, that when everything changes, which it's going to over the next sort of 5-10 years, you can find businesses that have access to this kind of intuitive, fundamentally right-brained responsiveness.
So how do you think of, like, you've talked a lot about how the biggest companies are left brain, and I think about a company like Google, now called Alphabet. They formerly had this 20% time, and their mission was like, don't be evil and organize the world's information. And it's inherently complex. And I want to make sure I'm understanding this right, but is that initial incarnation of Google a right brain company?
Yeah, I think so.
Um,
Yeah.
And has Google changed today? And are there any other large companies you'd point to? I like the Bruno Cucinelli example. That's fascinating. But any other companies that we could think through anecdotally that you'd say check the box of being right brained?
I don't know enough because I don't care anymore to follow companies, right? To be honest with you, I was speaking to my friends about this weekend because I was writing a piece about transcending Buffett. And the people that know and care more about this stuff, well, Glenn Eyre was one of the ones that came up. I think most of these companies are now private because the constraints are such in the public markets that you have to become increasingly left-brained because the time frames are shorter and you're going to get outcompeted. But Amazon refused to make a profit for a really long time because they are plowing everything back in. And look at what AWS did. That was an internal experiment. I think Gmail didn't quite come out of 20% time. I think that's an urban legend. But they did have all these. Google Maps. When you think about it, Google Maps is one of the most absurd things that's ever existed in human history. Like what it is and what it can do. And that came out of search wasn't straightforward. So Google for a while, I think, was doing this. Is Google as dynamic anymore? I get the sense from my friends that work in it, no, but I don't really know enough to say. My sense is that the awkward truth for people in the investment business who are looking for these quality businesses in private equity, no. Cost cutting, venture capital, no. People want power laws, and public equity. The reason why ESG was a sham is because there's basically no ESG companies in the stock market.
So I don't know if we should go there, and feel free to cut this short, but I'm wondering, when it comes to things like psychedelics and those kinds of things, does that actually help us make some connections within the brain that we otherwise would never make? What's your kind of verdict on that?
Well, I haven't taken psychedelics I took some mushrooms for the fun of it 30 years ago, but I haven't 25 years ago, but I haven't done psychedelics in a way that I can talk with authority. The therapeutic intervention I had was ketamine, which is dissociative, which certainly did give me an incredibly different perspective on life, but it isn't the same thing. I think I'm biased to say yes, based on the people that I've seen and what's happened to them. Psychedelics make you open, and the number one correlate of wisdom is openness. But psychedelics also make you too open. I'm witnessing now, thankfully not a feature of my community, but a lot of people that either get untethered by that they get a huge amount of insight overnight, and they haven't actually embodied or grounded that insight. And I'm a little bit worried about that as a longer term theme in the industry. But for people that are hyper left brain locked, I think it's probably a pretty good thing, but I don't know.
When I was reading some of your pieces, this notion of feeling integrated, being integrated, I'll just say candidly, I have taken mushrooms within the last 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I do think it's not the trip itself, it's the exit from it where you start feeling this sense of oneness and being integrated, so to speak. And it's a feeling that persists beyond when the clouds lift, so to speak, beyond your haziness. And, I read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, and I thought it was fascinating. He was someone who'd never taken psychedelics despite having come of age when a lot of his contemporaries were. And he did so as, I'd say, someone who's decently older. I think he was in his 60s or maybe even 70s when he did. And I found the book fascinating about how there's a lot of evidence that ties, and you talked about the shaman and the spiritual journeys, and it all seems to come together, so to speak. And maybe that's just the sense of the mushroom speaking, but obviously not on them right now. And that's it's hard to wrap your fingers around exactly what it is, but there's something magical about it.
Sure. I mean, again, with the context that I'm not an expert in literally anything, I've been kicking the tires on most therapeutic modalities with people that really do know what's going on. And there's this consensus emerging that I can feel that is around eternal family systems, which to anyone that's not familiar is basically that you're made of a multiplicity of parts. And some of them were like 6-year-old Tom was bullied and something horrible happened to him traumatically. And he then basically became like a dissociated part or had needs that weren't met. And that essentially you're comprised of a whole family of these parts. And some of them get disregarded, some of them get completely put in your shadow. And that part of the healing process that we go through is bringing all of these parts back into the light. Because if they're not in the light, they're going to be constantly sabotaging you by doing really weird stuff, or they're not being honored. And so they'll start being like, Elliot, you can't do that. You can't do that because we're not safe. You can't take this risk with your life because we're fundamentally not safe. And actually that part is reacting to something that happened, literally 40 years ago. And so when you talk about integration, there does seem to be this common idea of like, if you can integrate all the different parts of yourself and then direct it towards something that you can all agree on, which is a critical caveat, things do go really great for you, and you gain a much greater access to this attractor force that you feel through your body, through the right hemisphere, because you don't have so many bits of you being like, you absolutely don't want to do that because I'm terrified.
That was actually one of the most fascinating chapters in How to Change Your Mind, and it's a little darker than feeling great about something. It was, and you mentioned working in a hospice for a period of time when you were trying to find yourself, but end of life care. That one of the areas where they've most experimented with psychedelics are guided trips for people facing imminent demise and finding peace and finding a sense of oneness with the world and understanding their place in the universe, and overcoming the psychological burden of what's to come in order to make fruit of what's left. And having seen a couple very close people deal with that in the not too distant past, like very, very recently, you could see how the difference in having a feeling like that versus not can be for the very end. And I think when you could take it with a lot of things in life, when you could view it in the most extreme of circumstances and it works so damn well, you'd imagine in the less extreme of circumstances, it similarly can be as profound.
Well, going back to the hemisphere model, there's a really interesting dynamic that the left hemisphere is competitive with the right, but the right hemisphere isn't competitive with the left. The right hemisphere the right hemisphere integrates the left. So you basically have this situation where the right hemisphere never lies. It's one of the most remarkable features of all the left-right brain experiments. And the left brain lies whenever it doesn't understand something. So if you have someone with only their left brain online from a stroke, and you tell them the other side of their body is paralyzed, they'll deny it. And then when you show them their body is paralyzed, they'll say it belongs to the person in the next bed. And presumably this has the evolutionary function of the left brain, the ego, needing to be right quickly. That like just, if we were sitting around being like, is it a tiger? Is it not a tiger? I don't really know. We should probably like form a committee. Bang, you're dead, right? Like, so there's this move towards certainty, even if it means confabulation. So you have this situation where the thing that we use for analysis absolutely will not hand over the steering wheel because it is terrified. It does not like surrendering to the right hemisphere because it essentially feels like death. So you have a lot of these people that get stuck in midlife where a lot of this feels like fear of death. You have all these productivity bros desperately trying to increase their mortality through all these like faintly pathological means. But I think a lot of it is just representing this ability to really embody and understand right hemispheric way of living, which, going back to the start of the conversation, is literally what the hero's journey is all about. It's like, how do you move from being left hemisphere led to being right hemispheric led, and understanding that there might be an absolutely catastrophic fight in the middle of that as your left hemisphere clings on for dear life.
How do dreams fit in here? Because it seems like there's a lot going on at night in my head, even without any psychedelics.
I'm really glad you asked that. I wrote this weekend that the moment I can take dream analysis into a quant fund, I'll know that my work in life is done. The 7th episode of my series last year was with a guy called Dan Lawrence, who's an ex-futures trader turned a Jungian dream analyst. And he has an absolutely bananas view that completely blew my mind. That may not be true, but he essentially argues that dreams contain objective content. So I think most of the way that us understand dreams is essentially like, okay, we dreamed about a shark and our mother has always loved sharks, so this dream's about our mother. That it always has some reference back to ourselves. But he actually says that the dreams can often be communicating objective information to us from the field of consciousness. So let's be specific. He had a client of his that dreamed of this huge millipede crawling up his arm. And his client brought that to a session and said, I had this huge millipede crawling up my arm. It was really scary in the dream, so obviously it's something scary. So they Google the kind of millipede. They find the kind of millipede online, and they conclude that actually, like, this African millipede is completely harmless. But what it does do is spit a substance at its predators that repels them. And so they then start to work with the idea that actually, Elliot, are you repelling people in your life? And was this a message from the field using this symbol to show you that you need to repel people less? It's an absolutely bizarre inversion of the way that we view the world, but it's almost akin to the idea of Druckenmiller saying that the market's more intelligent than he is, right? That this information is coming to you from the outside world, and you need to be reacting to it in the same way that when you see patterns in dreams, it might contain information that is not obvious to you yet. And Dan's advice is not to always assume that the dream has some reference to you. It's actually to assume that there's content in the dream that might not be known to you yet, and therefore for you to sit with the dream. The other thing I'll say is that, and this is 10 out of 10 woo rating, but people that work with their dreams tend to start to become more precognitive. And people that work with their dreams tend to start to see more synchronicity in their lives. And I believe that synchronicity is the guiding force that shows you're integrated with the environment in a right hemispheric way.
So isn't the bottom line of it all like this? The analysis itself doesn't have to be objective, nor does it have to be right. It just gets you to be introspective. And so in doing so, you're going to discover truths.
It's an additional source of information. There's a great story about this guy, Emanuel Swedenborg. Have you ever heard of him?
No, not a name I know.
Yeah, nor me. So I did an interview with Joseph Campbell's protege and biographer, Stephen Larson, in the 5th episode of my series. And when we cut the tape, he was like, have you ever heard of Emanuel Swedenborg? And I'm like, no. And he was like, oh, I think he's probably the finest visionary of all time. I was like, wait, what? What? I've never even heard of this dude. So I went and read a book about him. And long story short, Swedenborg basically completed knowledge in the 1700s, that there was like only so much science you could know in the 1700s, and he knew it all and was this insane polymath. And then he was like, all right, I've done the external world, I'm going to do the internal world. And so he goes, using breathing techniques, he goes entirely within himself in a very Jungian way and basically maps the inner world of like heaven, hell, demons, angels. Like it's this wild cosmology that, whether it's true or not, I don't know. Not even that interested. But one of the things he did say is that he basically inverted his entire way of dealing with the world, such that in that moment between sleeping and waking, which for me is the most fertile, he essentially believed that all of the imagery and symbols that came to him were from God. So he went from thinking all of these ideas that are in my head from my left hemisphere are mine, and I'm really smart. Look at me, I'm really smart. Look at me, I'm really smart. To being like, oh my God, all of the best ideas come from God and they're not mine. And obviously the G word is pretty triggering for people, but you can see how that fits with Dan Lawrence's idea of like the things that are coming to you from dreams are coming to you with a very, very high level of intelligence, so high that it may not be from you. And so you need to take, I take that period of time incredibly seriously, because often I get whole articles downloaded into my head from who knows where that I then just go and write at my desk.
There is that saying that, when you trust yourself, you are implicitly trusting the intelligence that created you. Maybe that's a little bit related. But I'm also wondering whether you think that thoughts can have physicality.
Well, certainly the mystics I've been reading do. They think they have the concept of elementals, which is that any thought that you have goes out into the world and eventually comes back to you. So you really better not think nasty things about people. I don't know. What I've come to believe at this moment in time is that consciousness is the base of everything, which is like an increasingly uncontroversial view if you're actually paying attention to the science. Like materialism is done. Materialism has actually been done for about 120 years. We just haven't noticed yet. And whether or not that consciousness conclusion is right, then, there's something close to it that's right. And I'm always like, I don't really care about getting into all these philosophical arguments with people that are like 50 IQ points smarter than me. So the point up top is like, okay, well, what is this going to do? And for me, it makes me realize that the evolution of my consciousness is the most important thing. The most important thing is evolving your consciousness. In fact, we are here on Earth to evolve our consciousness. So you better not stay in the sinkhole of indifference in the middle where you basically do nothing. It's all about how am I evolving my consciousness? And I think part of the awkward truth is that sometimes people want to evolve the topics they're interested in beyond finance, or transcend and include finance. That they still want to work in finance, but they want to work in a different way. And a lot of the industries and the situations we find ourselves in, we find ourselves constrained by the container that we're in. And we don't like admitting to people that we no longer care about the stock market, or at least care as much. And that's certainly one of the major problems of evolution, self-evolution.
Do you feel that generally speaking, we as a human species are falling far short of our potential? There is that quote that was kind of misattributed to Einstein, that we only use 10% of our brains. But do you feel like there is a lot more there that we're not tapping into?
Yes and no. So I think the only using 10% of your brains thing is still using the wrong measuring stick. What are our brains, right? Like what does 10% of your brain even mean? Like if you think that consciousness is primary, we are receivers of consciousness. So you should say, what is my capacity for love? What is my capacity for integration? How well am I receiving the world, and how well am I navigating the world? How wise am I think is the dimension that we should be looking at. Like if you were using 100% of your brain, what would that actually look like in terms of daily life? Would you have a 250 IQ? I've listened to a bunch of the people with 200 IQs, and my God, they sound weird, right? Like I'm just not sure I'm not sure more intelligence is what we want. We want more integration. I'm going to make a disqualifyingly woo observation now, which is that there's a phenomenon happening right now that I've spent the last 3 years digging into with, you may be surprised to know, a lot of people on Wall Street, which is this podcast called the Telepathy Tapes, which was over Christmas the #1 podcast in America and probably in the world. I don't know if there's global charts. It beat Joe Rogan. And it essentially argues that a certain percentage of non-speaking autistic kids are demonstrating 100% telepathic accuracy with their mothers. It's the most interesting podcast I've ever listened to. I interviewed the maker. I interviewed one of the people that did the third-party experiments. I'm now 80-20 on it being real. The wildest thing is that these children, once they started talking to them, realized they weren't just telepathic. They realized they had access to non-local consciousness. so they could go and talk to other kids at a place called the Hill, which existed out of conventional space. They exhibited mediumship, prophecy, remote viewing, that these kids basically had access to, I think quantum consciousness would be the wrong word, but their consciousness wasn't confined to their bodies. And a lot of the mystics and the people that I've been reading for the last few years as a newbie essentially argue that the next iteration of human development is going to have more access to unity consciousness, that essentially our evolutionary trump card as a species has been connecting human ideas to each other, that we can all collaborate to make Boeings or pencils or whatever it is, right? But the next stage should be where we gain even greater access to each other's consciousness. The woo-woo suggestion being that is unity consciousness, where we become telepathic or increasingly psychic and can interact with each other that way. I appreciate even raising this topic is going to be, again, a disqualifier for a lot of people, but that is a way that we actually start to manifest like ultimate human potential, because it doesn't then become about you, me, and other people. It becomes about kind of all of us at the same time. And I think that might actually be what's emerging over the next few decades.
I find that fascinating. I've been on this quest to learn about the life sciences. It's one of the obsessions that I developed that I can't stop digging into. And I encountered this book by a Nobel Prize winner named Paul Nurse, and it's called "What is Life? 5 Great Ideas in Biology." And he tries to redefine what life is. He starts with the cell. The gene is one of the biggest discoveries, so to speak, since we'd talked about since like I took biology and what the definitions of life were back then. Evolution's been around for a long time. That's the third one. Chemistry is the fourth, but the fifth is collecting and using information as central to life itself.
Mm.
That if the purpose of the organism is not collecting and using information, then it is not alive. And so that very idea is central to life itself, and it's our purpose. And it includes things in his definition of life, like viruses, that when I took biology class were not included in definitions of life. But obviously, there are far grander beings that are included in that. And I think it's we're at an interesting time in history and in our own knowledge base, where I feel like we keep getting deeper into the most granular levels of things. Like the gene isn't even that spectacular anymore. You go down to the level of the proteome itself, like beyond just the DNA, beyond the RNA. And then I don't know, we're finding more in space. So we're reaching for the stars and reaching to the lowest common denominator at the same time. Anyway, kind of meandering, but I think that's really fascinating.
It's not meandering at all. But look what you just said. It's acquiring and using information. What have we just been talking about? We've been talking about the acquisition of expert intuition so that you can make good decisions. What is wisdom? Right? Wisdom appears to be being selected for as the highest human good, which is super funny because we don't ever talk about it because it sounds a bit douchey and pretentious, right? Like we're like, oh, I'm pursuing wisdom. Like, are you? Are you telling me you're wiser than me? But like, intelligence peaks in your 20s, dude, right? Like your IQ is not getting any higher and it's hyper heritable. So what are you actually spending your time on? And this was the reason why I did the Accelerating Wisdom series. I was like, my God, I realized you can actually get wiser. And the cultivation of this expert intuition is essentially, as far as I can tell, the point. And it improves every aspect of your life, but we don't focus on it because most of the spoils seem to go to people with the highest IQs. For now.
It's the definition of philosophy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lover of wisdom.
Yeah, but it's not now. Like, that's what annoys me. I was a philosophy undergraduate, and philosophy is now word games. When you think about what philosophia means, right? It's essentially love of wisdom. And that wisdom is an orienting fact, right? Like Sophia herself orients you in the world, that there is a relational force, your curiosity currently guiding you towards that book. That's what it's a love of. It's almost a love of love itself. Whereas when I hear philosophy, because of my background, I think of like Descartes and Hume and Hobbes and like logic and dumb word games that ultimately don't mean anyone to anyone. And in fact, probably are actively bad for you because they take you away from the world and start deconstructing your intellect. So when I think of philosophy, I think of more of it in like a Taoist sense, which is like, is this getting me closer to the flow of life? Because that ultimately is what we're all trying to do, I think.
So when I tell people I majored in bullshit because I was an undergrad philosophy major, it sounds kind of fitting.
You and me both, man. You and me both.
And Tom, when it comes to wisdom, I mean, does each of us arrive at our own wisdom, and they're kind of connected and similar, but not necessarily the same thing? I mean, just like existentialism is one way to understand the world, but someone else could arrive at a totally different conclusion.
I'm glad you asked that, because there's this idea at the core of things. It seems to be pretty accurate, but essentially the universe trends towards complexity, which, you have entropy. We're all going to die. Sorry, dude. And then you have what, one expert I've interviewed called syntropy, which is that everything around us is getting more conscious, more integrated, and more complex. What is complexity? Something that is complex is very, very differentiated and very, very integrated. So your body, if we were to sit now and just name how many parts of the human body there are, like, I don't know, 10,000? Like, I've literally no idea. And the only division is that we have names for them, right? But they're all individual wholes that get integrated into a larger whole. So like your cells are completely self-contained, but then they get included in tissues, the tissues get included in organs, the organs get included in your body, and then you become an integrated entity. That whole thing works without you really paying any conscious attention to it, right? Your digestion is going great guns right now, and there's nothing you're doing about it. Your gallbladder, you don't even know what it does, right? Like, it's all this is symphony working inside of you right now. That symphony does not stop at the edges of your skin. We are all members of a complex adaptive system. There is this pressure on you, this evolutionary force, I believe, acting on you at all times, pulling you into a state of very great differentiation and also integration, which seems like a paradox. And I like to think of it as your left hemisphere is aiming for differentiation, making you separate from the whole by making you pursue something you intrinsically love. What is my gift? What is hyper unique to me? And then your right hemisphere is making sure it's bloody well integrated. Because if you're not integrated, you're not in the system. Like, how long does a cell exist outside of your body? You're separate from all of the life force. So you need to have both things at once. But when you find that sweet spot, you're in the Tao, which is when you're paddling in the middle of the stream. Your ego's working, but your ego's working in a way that keeps you completely on base. So I find that the happiest people I know, are doing stuff that's often highly unique and hyper personal, which is why giving advice in this area is almost impossible, because it turns out that your niche is going to look radically different from everyone else's. But it also means there's no shame in you being interested in the weirdo crap that you're interested in, because ultimately that's probably very specific to your niche. And there actually might be a quote unquote career path in it. I've invented a career path for me. Yes, it took a midlife crisis, but like, you can find niches that are in fact highly, highly productive.
That's about all I have. Elliot, anything else you're interested in?
I'm generally interested in the idea of complexity, right? I was introduced to complexity science by reading Michael Mobson, and I went to a handful of Santa Fe Institute events and was just like fascinated by what I learned and what I hadn't really understood. And I guess two things that come to mind, because I'd read some of your stuff on complexity before, but I guess like in an increasingly complex world, do we need more right brain? Like, is that what's necessary to get by? And then it's an unrelated question, but it's one I'm curious about because you said, with AI is taking over our left brain. Is AI itself, because it is kind of relying on complexity. It's no longer like extrapolation models. They're deep learning, and like people who program this shit don't even know how it works. Like, is AI itself right brained? and it's coming after our left brain, or is it left brain?
I don't know, but both of those questions are the same question. I think we interact with the world through our bodies and predominantly our hearts. Our hearts are electromagnetic transmitters and receivers. They're not pumps, not primarily pumps anyway. We were taught wrong at school. This force, this Sophia, this love, this attractor, this syntropy, whatever you want to call it, signals relevance to us in the world. It allows us to focus on what's important, and it guides us through life. As far as I know, AI does not have access to that, which means that it's never going to be truly emergent. It's never going to be truly alive. It's going to be able to see patterns looking backwards that we could never have seen. It may even be able to create things we've never even been able to create. But fundamentally, there is a force in the universe that we aren't even beginning to understand. But we know when we harmonize with it, things go really, really, really well. I don't think AI is attached to that. It makes me very scared about what AI can do. The left hemisphere has proven, I mean, to answer your first question, like, we have godlike powers, but we've also destroyed 70% of the other species on Earth in 50 years, right? We have this unbelievable ability to make single point interventions in complex adaptive systems that also kill them semi-instantaneously, right? That's not the sign of a mature species. We've now created something that's even more powerful than that. And that gives me the heebies. But it might end up being artistic and wonderful and magical, and if controlled by the right people. But I went to see Eric Schmidt the other day. He's writing his new book, and his best recommendation for controlling AI was another AI. And I was like, oh, God, that doesn't fill me with confidence. This thing has to be led by the heart. It has to be led by love. And, you know, if you read any kind of mysticism whatsoever, love is the most powerful force in the universe. And I've never read it referred to at once on Wall Street, Silicon Valley, even in science. The word love never comes up. And the right hemisphere is connected to love. Your heart's connected to love. We just don't know what love is.
Well, definitely loved this conversation, Tom. It's been terrific. Learned so much. We could go on, but thank you so much for taking the time to join Elliot and myself and share some of your wisdom with our listeners.
It's been absolutely my pleasure, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Goodbye for now.
Thank you for listening to This Week in Intelligent Investing, brought to you exclusively by MOI Global, the research-driven membership organization. Learn more at moiglobal.com.